I'm not freezing up, am I?
Nope.
No.
Space there, and we'll be presenting with two other members. I'll let them introduce themselves now.
Hi, I'm Katie McNamara. I am also stationed at Nellis in Las Vegas. I'm a clinical social worker and happy to be here.
Hi, I am Chelsea Arnold, and I am stationed at Travis Air Force Base over in Northern California. And I am equally excited to be with you all today. And I know that Julie just popped up, but just so you know, we are recording this session for today.
All right, thanks. So today we're going to be talking about, you just see our agenda here. We're going to be talking a lot about the life course model and how it applies to family medicine residency and training of the residents in behavioral health principles. And so you can see kind of the agenda of the areas we'd like to cover. There's quite a bit of territory, but we'll try not to inundate you with just an abundance of material, but really highlight the keys here. So we can go to the next slide. You can see our objectives. We'd really like you to learn some things about the life course model. We'll get more into the specifics and the definition of it, but it's, again, I think it's one of the most relevant models that we can use and theories we can use for family medicine education. And then we also want to talk about values-based living and how that can be utilized when we're working with residents and talking about their patient care.
Mark, you're lagging. You're lagging a little
slide.
bit. You might want to turn off your video.
All right, so my internet has been not cooperating very well the past few days, so I'm gonna turn off the video just so I can not lag. Can everybody hear me okay?
A lot better.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So we don't have any financial disclosures. We also need to let you know that any information or opinions or stories that we present are not representative or indicative of policies of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. Air Force. So they're our own opinions. You can go to the next slide. And so I came up with the topic of this, or the title of this topic, Cradle to Grave, simply because one of the things I really liked about social work when I first got into it was that we care for people across the spectrum of their life. We take care of we take care of geriatrics, we work an inpatient thing. So we're both kind of on the same page as far as that goes. And so when we look at kind of this model called the life course model, we're really looking at all of everyone kind of applies and falls under this model. And why this topic, one of the things I've noted when I first came into working in a family medicine residency is how hard the residents work. I've been impressed with that from day one, with the extent that they just dedicate themselves to mastering their craft, to learning about their patient, to try and do good work. Really, that we can help, or that I could help with as the presenter, is to be able to help them ease that burden. And one of the ways is giving them a model and a way to look at the patient that kind of makes sense, that's comprehensive, and that helps them put their patient in perspective and in a sense that they're able to more easily facilitate some of the behavioral health principles that we talk about and address in the residency. And so with that, I'll turn the time over to Chelsea and talk a little bit more specifics about the model.
Thank you. So this is just an overview of a definition of the life course model. And really just keep in mind, this is a holistic perspective on an individual and how it integrates your macro level, so your outside factors outside of the individual, and then obviously the individual level influences and how all of those come into play when we're looking at our health as we move through our life. Next slide. So I know for this slide, there's multiple little tiles here, and I'm going to highlight a few of the important ones that I find important. They're all important, but I want you to know that if you get these slides, there'll be notes, and so you can look more into the notes on specifically what each of these tiles mean. So in 1918 to 1920, W.I. Thomas, he did this study called The Polish Peasant in Europe and America. And this was a fairly foundational study. It was it's a classic sociology study, and it was the first that really looked at the integration of, integrated theory and data into how we look at individuals and the context in which they are living their life. So for this study example, he studied the transition from Polish peasants from Poland to the US and to Europe. And he just found that depending on where those individuals were, impacted their life differently. And this is that first foundational study. It's really important to how the life course was developed. As we move through time, it kind of falls off, and then C. Wright Mills, who's another American sociologist, picks this back up. And here, as you can see through the tiles, the importance of the different longitudinal studies and how we're starting in America to recognize that it's really important to take into context how we as individuals are impacted by our life as we move through these life stages. And so in regards to the contextual change, this is really important because then we start to gain this understanding of we can, based on the context in our lives, we are being impacted differently. So an example I think of is 9/11 and how, depending on where you were in your life, could have impacted you differently for those individuals in New York City compared to us watching on TV. So as we move through time, we start to recognize that age becomes really important because in the 50s, we're noticing a increase in life longevity and the importance of how that plays into understanding our life trajectories. And all of this concludes to the life course model and the development to present day.
All right, so I'll be presenting here about some of the concepts, the key concepts in the life course model. And the three that there's actually four we want to really highlight, but the first one is, the first three are trajectory, transition, and turning points. And what's really important to understand here is that throughout our lives, our life kind of takes a pattern of where we're going to go and what we're going to do. So trajectory, I have a son right now who's looking at going to college, and he's kind of deciding where he wants to go and what he wants to study. And we've talked about it, and I've told him, there's any number of good things you can do, but each one's going to take you on a slightly different path. That doesn't mean they're going to be bad. It just means they're going to be different. And so people's health choices and life choices put them on a trajectory that then brings them into contents. These are important times, or kind of beginning or end phases in life. We often think about going off to college or getting married or having children or retiring. These are major transitions in people's lives that impact their quality of life potentially, and how they navigate, able to help them. But I think we can train our family medicine residents to really be mindful of these moments as well. And then you have turning points, and these are things that happen individually, or they're sentinel moments, if you will, in somebody that you just weren't aware of, and then they say something that really profoundly impacts you. But it can happen on an individual or an institutional level. And then finally, we want to really focus on the historical time and place and principles of the life course model. This is the one that really sets it apart from others, is that we don't just take into account events in people's lives and how they're doing, but we're looking at the broader social and historical context. And this really came into me, or are you guys able to hear the audio okay? Getting some comments that it's cutting in and out.
Yeah, it is cutting in and out.
Yeah, sorry about that. Maybe I'll try and talk slower, but if we can go back to the previous slide, there's just one part I want to highlight if possible. Is the historical time and place of this model. So what we then have is there was an event that happened when there was 9/11. I was doing a Balance session with the residents on that particular day. Happened to be a Monday that we were doing it, and I was talking with them, and since it was 9/11, I felt like we needed to talk about that a little bit. And I asked all the residents, where were you when 9/11 happened? And I got responses from, well, I was in 3rd grade, or I was, at home waiting for the bus, or, that just different things that when I thought about it was so different from where I was in college, and, just experienced it on a totally different level. And not that it was any less meaningful or impactful for them, but it was just different. So our difference in age shaped the way that we responded to and experienced a historical event. And so I think that is really important to take into account the cohort and the historicalness of events for people as they're going through life. And again, it shifts people's perspective that can then come out in the way that they present themselves in clinic. We can go to the next slide.
Okay, for this slide, we have this little graphic that I find really valuable because it shows how our government and our larger systems and our policies in health not only impact us on a vertical manner, but also across our life course. And essentially that just means that as a whole, as we move through these different systems in our life, we see that they're impacted differently. And an example that I can think of is Medicaid. As you can see, these policies in health impact all the way down to the individual. Over time, Medicaid policies have changed to include more disabilities. So maybe an individual from 20 years ago as a child didn't receive the same type of care as they do now as an adult, given where we are in our healthcare policies. And this is also not to pull too much on politics as we are in the current moment, but recognizing that politics, even if we don't always appreciate them, they really do impact us from all these different levels, from top down and bottom up. Next slide.
All right, so we have, again, another place where we want to address why this is important across the lifespan of individuals and why family medicine is so important. And one story that kind of sticks out to me is a story about my grandmother. She lived to be, I think, 88 or 89. And as she was kind of approaching that age, she went into her family physician for an evaluation. And the doctor at the end of the visit said, well, Mrs. Dixon, it was nice knowing you, and I wish you the best. And basically was just kind of ending the relationship. Years, and they'd gotten to know each other really well. And she said, well, are you moving? Are you retiring? What's happening? I didn't know you were leaving your practice. And he simply said, no, you're going to be dead by our next appointment. I told you to stop smoking for years and you haven't, and you're simply not going to make it to your next appointment. That turned out to be an incredible change for my grandma, who then quit smoking that day, even though she'd been a 40-year, 2-pack a day type smoker. And she lived another couple years. So fortunately, she did make it to her next appointment. But I think it was interesting that that moment, that doctor saw what we can call a nodal point or a transition, or something like that, where there's an imminent moment of potentially her death. And he took advantage of that to change the quality of her life and to grant her a longer life. It would have been just as easy to not say anything. He told her to stop smoking for years, but he changed his approach in such a way that made her alter her behaviors. And we're internally grateful for that. And in fact, I think the only thing the gripe we have with that physician is that we wish he would have done that years earlier. But again, he did a brilliant thing to help her out. But I think that's the key of why we want to look at not just people across the lifespan and where they're at right now, but where they've come from and what's important to them and how their values really play an impact in their life. So we can go to the next slide.
For this slide, I want to draw your attention to the roles section. I think, at least in my experience, our residents seem to have come into family medicine because they wanted to embody all of these roles. So it jives really well with the life course model. And I think especially when we compare this to maybe other fields they could have gone into in medicine, I don't know if other fields like surgery or emergency medicine necessarily would be able to embody these kinds of roles. So of course, that's not to say that other fields don't jive with the life course model. Here we can see several other fields of medicine where the life course model is relevant. We have pediatrics, public health, geriatrics, etc. I know in the chat, a number of people said, I haven't really heard of the life course model before, and I hadn't either, but it makes so much sense if we look at it this way. So not sure how many of you have heard of acceptance and commitment therapy. I'll just call it ACT. It's a bit of a mouthful. This is a subset of cognitive behavioral therapy that also includes mindfulness and a variety of Buddhist philosophy ideals. So ACT, it's a behavioral therapy. It teaches us how to take mindful, values-based actions. And this is important in a life course model because we're always seeing our patient not just as who they present to us in the appointment, but also in terms of how their behaviors are consistent or inconsistent with their overall life goals and values. So from an ACT perspective, a successful life does not mean that I am accomplishing goals. It means that I'm living out my values. We have over here a picture of this man. I'll never forget, a professor was teaching me about ACT, and he had this great example of, we are all born into a life full of holes, and the longer we live, the more holes we're going to fall into. We are blindfolded. We have no idea which holes it's going to be. I think of my grandma. I think of, she was born into extreme poverty and living in southern Italy, and then immigrated to America and didn't speak the language and had, problematic life, several miscarriages, which were very traumatic for her, and eventually a divorce. But if you were to ask her towards the end of her life, how was your life successful? She would say, yes, because she lived out her values, and specifically Catholicism was very important to her. And so every time she fell into one of these holes, she was able to use the values, the community from her church to help herself dig herself out of those holes. So how we handle falling into those holes matters from an ACT perspective. And also from an ACT perspective, we look at love and pain as intimate dance partners. It's impossible to live a full, rich, values-based life without experiencing the whole spectrum of emotions. So here's actually the handout that I use with my patients, the feelings wheel or the feelings pie. We have a iteration of that here on our slide. So if we attempt to avoid any of these negative or uncomfortable emotions, then it adds additional problems. So I have an example of a patient who she tells me that in childhood she was taught not to be sad or have any kind of those ugly emotions, as her parents called them. She was raised in I think her dad was a pastor, and so she and her brothers and sisters were told, we always present happy and joyful. That is the kind of family we are for this community. So she learned to not know how to feel sadness or pain, and not have others know that she's feeling those things. So as she grew up, she understandably had some challenging moments. She realized that her and her husband were not actually good together, and she was feeling a lot of sadness about that. But because she hadn't been taught how to feel that feeling, she relied on alcohol and ended up developing a substance use disorder, which is when she came to me, realizing, a bottle of wine a night is increasing to almost 2 bottles of wine a night, and I am isolating from my husband, from my kids. There was even an affair that she decided to experience, and that all caused additional problems, as you can imagine. So had she learned how to experience sadness and anger in a healthier way and tolerate that distress, we can see how that would have avoided a number of additional problems for her. Turning it over to Mark.
Right. So another aspect we want to look at with the ACT model, and I think the part that's really important here is the connection between the life course model and the values, is that as people transition through their life and experience these different aspects of their life, their values are then influenced over time. And so one of the things that is really important, and I found this in an ACT lecture series, you can see the reference down there. So I think it's, there's a really good reference you can find if you need it. But they brought up that there's inflexibility and fear which lead to human suffering. And I thought this was really interesting because it implies values and some of the things that impact the way that people kind of go through those lives and the holes that they end up falling into. And part of it is, you look here, these are almost kind of some of those stinking thinking kind of things that we talk about, and just maybe another version of it where, thoughts become reality, and that just because somebody thinks something doesn't mean that is the way that it is. But I want to look at two others here: evaluation, which is judgments of yourself and the world from your experience. And again, if you think about people that have experienced life in a particular way, there's a different perspective that comes. And share a quick story. When I was deployed to Afghanistan, this is about 10 years ago, I was able to call on Memorial. I was there on Memorial Day in 2011, and I called my wife's grandfather, who was a World War II bomber pilot. At the time, it was the U.S. Army Air Corps, but he then became into the Air Force after that separated. But I called him and talked with him a little bit. I was in Afghanistan, and he had been deployed as well in World War II. And it was interesting because with that connection of me being deployed in an area where it's not in the same area that he had been in, but there was that commonality, that bond there. He shared stories with me that nobody in his family had ever heard. And so I grabbed a pen and paper and was frantically writing as much as I could, but he started sharing stories about his combat experience and his life during World War II and in the military that again, nobody had ever heard. But because of that connection, he was able to evaluate that I was someone that he could trust for some reason when it came to those moments in his life that were so critical, and those were turning points for him. And then the other point that I want to focus here on is avoidance, which is essentially being closed to new or uncomfortable experiences. You know, and I'm going to ask a rhetorical question: how many of us have had patients, and how many family medicine residents or faculty have had patients that are resistant to change? We can present them a glorious treatment plan. We can come up with ideas that would truly help their quality of life, but they resist it. They're not open to it. And so these issues here, the inflexibility and fear, kind of play on their values. Sometimes we need to evaluate that in order to help them see how this change is going to not only meet their values, but also improve their life. Go to the next slide.
So as Mark was saying, instead of trying to avoid those uncomfortable or negative emotions, instead we teach our patients, ourselves, our residents to cultivate these other options. So for example, acceptance. We can imagine that our uncomfortable or new negative emotions are a little bit separate from us. So from an ACT perspective, there are a number of metaphors. There's actually something called the Big Book of ACT Metaphors, if you're interested. And one of those is that we imagine, let's say, sadness as a ball that I'm holding out a little bit away from myself. I'm not consuming the sadness and letting it take over. I'm not fusing with it, as they would say. And I'm also not throwing the ball away. It's impossible to do that. That kind of avoidance is going to cause a number of other problems that we discussed earlier, like numbing with drugs or alcohol, or avoiding emotional intimacy, for example. So instead, I hold it here. I allow it to exist. I give it permission to be near me. I soften around it. I breathe into it, and I'm not fighting it. So this is all part of distress tolerance skills that we can build for ourselves and those we serve. You can see here an image of this woman over here. She has fallen into these holes, as we all do, because if we live long enough, we'll experience suffering, but she's been able to use healthier coping mechanisms to emerge.
Okay, so jumping into this idea of values-based medicine. So for the life course as it applies, we really want to consider the context of a patient's life in how they are moving through healthcare, right? Well, we also want to take into consideration their values and how those values can be proven to be essential in how they are managing these health patterns, and how we can incorporate their values to hold effective behavior patterns and positive change, right? So before we even dive in more to this idea of values-based medicine, looking more into what is a value and how do we develop values. So values are, as we can see, defined as chosen life directions or guiding principles for behavior. So I ask you just to reflect, what do you want life to be about, and why is this important to you? And by answering those questions, we can start to identify the values in our life. And I like to clarify that values are not the same as goals. So goals are what we want to achieve along the way, whereas values are the direction we are moving. So in this next slide, we're going to dive into a couple more different value categories, if you will. So we have the role of culture. And culture is where we ask ourselves, what do you value in your culture? And what does it mean to you? We have family. Family is asking ourselves, what kind of brother, sister, mother, husband, wife, friend do we want to be in this lifetime? Spirituality. spirituality means a little different for something different for everyone. And whatever that means to you is completely okay. It can be nature or something as formal as attending a church. I know for me, I found a lot of value in yoga and meditation, and that is my spiritual practice. And then we have society. So what part of society do you value? Do you volunteer? I used to volunteer at a dog shelter, and I loved it. And that really was a part of my identity in that. And then medicine, of course. So with medicine, this is where we're not only looking at ourselves, but also our patients, and what do they value as far as their health? Do they value sleep and diet and exercise? Or maybe right now their values are more centered around substance use and being able to identify those. So I want to take a moment here and ask you, what are some of your values? So if you would like to share, we would love to see that in the chat box. And then we can talk about those briefly here. I see family and faith. Family, service to others, faith. Compassion. Growth. Grandchildren and their future. I thank you all so much for sharing. I think this is really important for not only us to identify our values and our residents and helping them identify values, but I think when we identify these, we can also start to understand how we can help our patients identify their values. Because I know without having, for me, when someone didn't help me to shape and formulate those, it was hard to understand what was valuable to me. So, and this is definitely applicable as well when we think about the life course and how these values do transcend the way we live our life. So thank you all for sharing. We'll move on to the next slide.
All right, so with this, we want to kind of, again, bring in a connection here with the values and then, again, teaching residents. There's this idea out there about values-based practice. You can find a lot of information out there about it, but it's simply using the skills that we have in the practice skills. This is below of awareness. And again, this falls in well with the ACT type model of just being conscious of what the individual is thinking and what is important to them. I also find that knowledge and use of narratives is so important. That's one of the things I've always enjoyed trying to teach residents is what's the patient's story. You know, and I would also teach them that, you know, when you meet with somebody, you know, there's this pressure sometimes to get a full assessment, and we do want to get as much information as we can. And I often tell them, is like, sometimes in your session, you can just get one new personal information about that patient. Find something new about them each time you meet them. And over the course of time, you end up learning a whole lot and you get to know that person. You know, and because that's one of the things I've found with most residents is that they really want that connection. That's kind of what brought them into family medicine. And so that's one way for them to do that, is to use that knowledge, is to find out their story one piece at a time. But I think it's also important, the practice skills here, to help elicit the values in communication. That there's a lot of different perspectives that come in. There's the individual, there's historical, there's a lot of different perspectives that help them shape that. So these are skills that you can help the residents simply recognize and utilize while they're working with patients, especially if it's about issues related to transitions or turning points, or things that are going to have a true impact on their day-to-day and quality of life. Go to the next slide.
So as we start to summarize the whole presentation, it's important that we are teaching our residents to conduct comprehensive assessments, recognizing where this patient is at in terms of all of these different pillars. So for example, in thinking of how a person's presentation and what they can share with you might change in time and place. I'm thinking of a patient I had a couple weeks ago who is a woman who dates women, and she's active duty. And only a few years ago, she would not have been able to come into my office and talk about this terrible breakup that is causing her so much pain, because she would have either had to change the pronouns or wouldn't have been maybe feel safe coming in and telling a provider the reality of their life. But because of, like Chelsea was mentioning, policies can then trickle down and impact the person's actual experience and what they can share in your provider room.
All right, so now we're gonna kind of wrap up here as we talk about this model and how we use it, in that we want to look at the role of the resident. And so ultimately what we're trying to help the residents do is learn the patient perspective. And again, if we look at their historical and developmental context as applied in the life course model, we're trying to understand their values. It's super important that they can look at all of that in a perspective. And on the side, there's a comment that says the visit always means something. This has never been more important than I've noticed in the military. There's a lot of military members who are resistant to come in to get medical help for any reason. And so typically if they're there, there's a reason, there's something going on. And I also have another story then. And one of the things, this is kind of, for me, it was a turning point when it comes to my perception of family medicine and even my desire to work in any degree in family medicine. Is years ago, I was in Indiana and working as a substance abuse counselor there. And I had something that came up and I needed to go in and talk to the doctor. And when I got there, you know, the doctor came in cowboy boots and he sat there and talked to me about Colorado, which is where I'm from. I then talked about how much he liked Indiana and why he likes it. We spoke about my family. He asked me about my kids and my spouse. We talked about my job. We talked about a lot, and we ended up spending only 20 minutes in the appointment, but I felt like it was much longer. And when it came down to the time to really talk about what brought me in, he then had a perspective of how that issue was impacting my life and even the way that I looked at things and what my thoughts are about my health. And so he was able to really, in my mind, not only address my physical need, but also he really helped me to calm down mentally. He helped me to put what was going on in perspective, and it really helped. And when I think back on that, that was the first time I've seen a family medicine doctor like that really practice that craft of not just prescribing a medication, not just following an algorithm, but really taking the whole person concept and putting it into practice. And again, to this day, if I could go back, I would love to have that man as my family physician, because he was so good at it. And then again, we can go, I don't want to go through each one of these one by one, but because you can see that, but there's a couple that I think really are valuable here. And negotiating value conflicts. This is where we talk about, you know, patient-centered care. We need to know what our values are, and we need to know what the patient's values are. And those aren't always the same thing. They may want something that we don't think is good for them. And so the training is to teach the residents how to negotiate that and how to really come to a resolution both with the patient and with themselves when they have to do something sometimes where they really don't feel like they should or need to. And then finally, want to really focus on the identity or identify transitions and turning points. I have found in my own practice over the years that this is the time that people most want to come in and need to talk. It's also the time that they're most open to change, is when there's a major transition or when there's something that's fundamentally changed their life, that's when they're most open to self-improvement and changing aspects of their life to improve their well-being. And so the more we can help residents understand those turning points, I think the better off they're going to be able to meet the needs of their patients. Right, so we've covered a lot of territory. We've kind of looked at the fact that there's a model out there that talks about, it's much like the ecological model in some ways, but it adds historical context and several other things to consider, such as the turning points and timing and trajectory of people's lives. But the ultimate goal here is to take away is that the people have a unique perspective, and that comes from their experience. It comes from their developmental stage. It comes from their historical context. And so people aren't coming to us in a vacuum, and that family medicine is in a powerful position to influence people throughout those transitions and those turning points, because that's where it's going to ultimately change their health trajectory. And so if we can help people get on a better trajectory, whether it's at one of those turning points or other times, that is all the better for them and for us. And then finally, the life course model and the values-based living and the ACT model, I think they work together. As we've been able to convey that, they really work together to provide a model for training residents about looking at the person in a context that is pretty comprehensive, and then also how to evaluate and work with the patient and be with them in the moment, so that they can utilize those skills that they have to the greatest effect. And so hopefully you've at least gotten that throughout from this presentation. But we now have obviously some time left over, but just want to know if people have questions. You can unmute and talk if you want to, but we'd really love to get your feedback, any comments or experiences you've had with things like this. Anyway, we'll kind of open up the floor for a few minutes.
I have a question.
Yes.
How would you apply the values-based perspective working with patients around physical activity? So patients who maybe have certain health problems and aren't engaging in physical activity, and you wanted to somehow connect that to their values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start off with.
And I'm asking you it because we're doing a workshop in about a week and a half on this topic.
Right. There's a lot of different ways to kind of approach that. I think there's always the miracle question. If you woke up tomorrow and this illness was gone, what would you be doing with your life? And that's one way to approach it, to find out maybe what they want. But I've also found that helping people kind of look at their physical condition that limits them as a loss, and work with them through the grieving process and say, that is gone. All the goals and things that you had that you wanted to do and accomplish, that moment is gone. You can't really do that anymore. But I'm wondering what you can do now, and then I'll list, either a couple of skills or talents that they have and say, is there any way we can utilize this to help you move forward and find some other avenues to really be productive and that kind of thing. And so it's a way to evaluate where they've been and what they've kind of used in life. And we can also ask them what's important. Like, if in 5 years, where do you want to do? What do you want to have accomplished? So there's a couple different aspects, and it looks like there's some really good comments here too.
I would also add, I have this very memorable example with a patient where he was just non-compliant with the PCM's recommendations to lose some weight and get more active, like you're talking about. And so the PCM sent him to me. Here's this non-compliant patient, help him, lose the weight that I want him to lose for his health. And I asked the patient, do you want to be more active? Do you want to be more physically active? He was like, not for the reasons that my PCM keeps telling me to. Like that stuff, the physical health, worries about developing whatever physical health problems isn't a problem to me. But what I really do care about is the fact that now I'm retired and now I can finally spend time with my wife. And I want to have more years to do that. We've both been working for decades and now we can finally be together. He was also like, I also just want to have like a good sex life with her. And I feel like if I'm more confident in my body, I will be able to do that. Like now we can finally focus on one another. We got to that emotional why. So always digging down to that emotional why, that can then connect what the PCM wants the patient to do and what the patient actually wants for themselves.
And also just to add to that piece, I know I saw someone earlier said that this is similar, some of the things we're talking about, similar to motivational interviewing. And so something that I teach residents is really to help patients identify those intrinsic values versus the things on the outside world that may have been told is important to them because for some reason, like for instance, smoking. So smoking is important to quit because society has told us. But if you only draw on those reasons, it's really not going to have any value to heart. And so to Katie's point, having that emotional why answered, really digging down intrinsically, why does this matter to you? I think really speaks leaps and bounds for patients and really helps them to move forward in that positive progress.
Thanks for bringing that up, Richard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other comments or questions that other people have? If not, we can give you a little bit of time back in your life.
Yes, and to Amber's point, please make sure you fill out the evaluation. We appreciate your feedback and everyone's participation, and it was great to meet you all.
All right. And again, thanks all for participating and enjoy the rest of the forum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, take care.